spacing property and the word spacing properties are very handy in CSS, and that's called, letter spacing is known as kerning, and we're talking about the white space between the letters, okay? Well, here it's actually orange space, right? But we're talking about the space between the letters. And so we're going to add some space between the letters in the word, in the classic taxi heading. So we come back here, and in our H1, on our taxi layout CSS page, we're going to add letter spacing and word spacing. Now why, you ask, in the textbook, did they add letter spacing here and word spacing here? They're not going to tell you this in the textbook, I don't think, but typically you alphabetize these commands. So if you have a whole bunch of them, they're alphabetized. There are a few that you should put first when it comes to layout, but unless it tells you to put them first, then alphabetize them. So we're going to say letter spacing is 0.2 EM. No, is it? I can barely see. It's been a long day. Semicolon. And then here, after text transform, we say word spacing is 0.5 EM. Semicolon. Save. Come back here, and let's see what happens. We're talking about this is going to happen here in our H1, right? So let's see what happens. Oops. When I refresh. You see? So it spaced it out between the letters. And now we're going to do some text indenting. On page 167, we see the syntax for that. For the P selector, the paragraph selector, we're going to, oh, here's the problem. Look at this. Remember earlier when I said, what's wrong with this? Why is this still this color when it's white in the book? It's because we were supposed to, at some point, take this line out. There it is. Okay. So now it says text indent 3 EM semicolon. Control S, and let's look at what happens to our paragraphs now. Here are our paragraphs. Now we took out this background color, right? And we indented the text. So let's see what happens when we refresh. Wow, lots of changes, huh? So we go on. On page 168, it talks about designing printer-friendly web pages. You need to check that out. And if you are still looking at the PowerPoint, this is about the font family property and the most common font family style properties. And this is about the font size that I told you. EM is a relative unit to make whatever the normal size is, bigger or smaller. These are other ways that you can express font size in absolute units. These are the choices for text transform. You can capitalize like this, lowercase, text appears in all caps with uppercase, or none. You would use none if you had previous values stated. Here is where we did the spread heading, if you need to study that a bit more. Here's where we indented text. Here is where we look at line height, which is our next step. So here in the taxi layout file, we add the following CSS property to the P style rule, and that is line height 1.5 EM semicolon. Save, and let's see what that does to our paragraph. Here's a paragraph. We're going to look very closely at this paragraph and see what happens when we refresh. Okay, so we just got a little bit more space here, a little bit more white space there. Now on page 170 it talks about the font shorthand property. So let's go back to the PowerPoint on that because it's really important. The font property is one of several CSS shorthand properties, and it's where you can put several things in a line, in a row, combine several things in a row. So here we have an example of the fonts listed. We have a font style, a font weight, a font size, and a font family. But we can use the shorthand style of writing CSS and putting them all on one line. Now notice, when we put them all on one line, we take out all these extra semicolons. There's a semicolon at the end of the line, but here instead of saying font style, font weight, font size, font family, we just say font, colon. And we say italic, normal, 1.2 EM, Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. So we still have our commas here where we would have had them here, but everything else is just a spacing goes between them. But they must be listed in the correct order, which makes it, you know, a little tougher. If you do it up here, it's not so important that it be in the correct order. As you can see, font family alphabetically does not come after font size. It would have been the first thing. But in this case, it must be in the order of font style, font weight, font variant, font size, font family for it to work. Now, if you recall, on page 145, when we created our embedded style sheet before we erased that and went to our external style sheet, we had typed in an H1 style that was a color of orange and a text-align center, which had caused our H1 here, before we had a background on it, to be orange and centered. We erased that because we were just playing with the embedded style sheet at that time. And I didn't much explain what text-align meant, but text-align is how we can line up our text, either left, flush with the left margin, flush with the right margin, centered horizontally, or justified so that the any row that wraps will go up to the right margin. Justification in text is not recommended. It's what you see in a newspaper, but it's been learned over the years that it's harder to read, to have the irregular spacing. It's particularly harder to read for elderly people. As our eyes go, we certain things become harder and harder for us to distinguish, and so a full justification is harder for older eyes to read than a left justification. So we don't generally want to fully justify something if there's any chance that we're going to have elderly people looking at it. We also don't like to use all caps. I don't know if you've noticed, but they've started changing the signs here in College Station and Bryan, the street signs, to have to not have all capital letters. They started changing it to be what is it? Lowercase with the first of each word capitalized, because that's easier also to distinguish when your eyes get older. Just a little heads up for you if you're going to be doing this for anything other than your crazy music page. So on page 171 it says we're going to go back to this page. We're going to add the CSS property to the H1 and footer styles for text-align. And remember, we're going to try to be alphabetical unless they tell us otherwise. So here in the H1, we're going to say text-align, center. So we're going to put it back in the way it was before. And then we're going to go down to the footer. And we're going to say text-align, center, which I am so relieved because that footer looks dreadful. Did I get everything in there? Because I was talking so much I could have easily made a mistake. And see how hideous this footer is? Ugh, it's just nasty. It's not lined up properly. It's a different size. It's just disgusting. So we're going to watch as our H1 is centered and as our footer is centered by F5, and there they are. So isn't that much nicer and neater? On page 172, the text talks about removing the underlines on links. The underlines on links are called text decorations. So we use the text decoration property and then the value. The values for text decoration property are none, underline, or line through. And it's become common, it's become best practice in web design to not have all your links underlined. And to actually, when you mouse over them, to have them change. And that's another thing that another command we'll look at. property we'll look at. But in the meantime, we're going to take out those underlines for our links. And so that on our style sheet would be A is where our links are defined. I'm going to come down here and we're going to add text decoration, none. Save. Come back here and let's look at what that looks like up here. See, it's much cleaner. Now when we mouse over it, nothing happens. We are going to learn how to do a hover effect so that it's more obvious when we have a link. But there's one thing that lets you know it's a link, and that is when you're, look at my mouse. My mouse is a little open triangle, open pointer. When I mouse over it, it turns into a finger pointer. So that's how you still know it's a link. But it's really not obvious enough. On page 174, after we've set the text decoration to none, we see that the person who hired us to do the job likes everything we've done, and she wants us to make the whole site like that, because look what happens. This is my index page, right? But look at this page. Ew. This page. Ew. This page. Ew. We're going to change all of those magically just by linking them. So come back to here, to our index page, grab that link, and copy it. So you put your mouse here, Shift Home, Control C, and then we're going to put it on the same place on each page. So right under the title, save, save, save. Obviously we're not going to put it on this page. Now let's go back and see what happens. When I refresh this page, gorgeous. And all of the pages are now refreshed and beautiful. We have a nice theme for our site, don't we? So this is why we use CSS. Now you get it. Why did I have to learn 2 different languages in 4 weeks? Well, now you get it. So you're going to validate this, and then you're going to zip and submit your files. So congratulations on another job well done.